Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eric Berger. I'm the senior space editor of Ars Technica. And with this Ars Live event, we've got a real treat for you. I'm joined this afternoon by two of my favorite people in the industry, reporters I really respect, I compete with every day. Um, for the discussion today, we have Chris Davenport, a longtime reporter on spaceflight from the Washington Post, and Joey Roulette, who's worked at a number of prestigious outlets, currently at Reuters. All three of us have good sources in the industry. We try to keep our ear very close to the ground on what's going down in the space industry and what's going up. And today we're here to tell you what we really think about what's going to happen to NASA in particular, in the space industry in general, over the next couple of years during the Trump presidency and beyond. So Joey and Chris, thanks very much for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us. Yeah.
So let's start with the kind of big news of the week and talk about the Starship launch. Chris and I were down there. I did not see the webcast to know that the rocket, the second stage, ultimately failed. We could see the explosion of the first stage, which was kind of dramatic there in South Texas. But I'm wondering, let's start with you first, Chris. What do you think about the fact that we're on the ninth flight test and the upper stage still has very serious reliability issues?
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting that this happened, pretty well into flight, right? I mean, the engines had fired. It seemed to go nominally, and then all of a sudden, yeah, I had left. Eric and I were watching the flight from down at Starbase, or just outside the keep out zone, and I was on the way back to the hotel, just sort of listening to it, and had to pull over because it was like, uh-oh, it started tumbling. We both got some time with Elon, and one of the things he told me was he really wanted to test out, the reentry of Starship. I think that's one of the main things. They really want to put it through its paces, check the heat tiles, and the fact that they, really didn't get to that part, I think, is a pretty significant setback. That said, they did refly the booster, which is a very big deal. Seems like maybe that got lost a little bit, like on the ninth flight to take a booster and to refly it is no small feat. I mean, so clearly there are some victories here. It's just a matter of, I think, of how quickly they're able to get back out to the launch pad. If they're launching again in 3 to 4 weeks and are able to sort of get that data, then it's really, I don't think, that big of a deal. If we're, now going on weeks or into a matter of months, then I think it'll have more of an impact.
Joey, what do you think about the fact that we're kind of a few years into this test campaign now and it's still very much a test campaign?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely, a lot of progress they've made. What they're doing is pretty crazy. And just thinking, back to a few years ago and imagining us getting used to these giant behemoths launching into space would be pretty wild. But there's so many more milestones that SpaceX has to do with Starship that we all know. I mean, the in-space cryogenic refueling, landing on the moon or Mars, whatever, and deploying satellites into space. It hasn't even done that yet. So there's, a lot of hurdles that they're trying to cross right now. And this is apparently like a new block of Starship. So they're, kind of working out the kinks of that. And maybe they'll overcome it in a few flights. I don't know. But I mean, after they do pass this initial, technical roadblock, they still have a long ways to go. So I don't think it's good. A lot of what SpaceX does in testing, of course, is more visible than other companies, so we tend to have a different kind of perspective on it. But, I think they're just kind of going through a hard time right now.
It's a bit of a strange period for me as well too, because it seems like the fix for the stage two propulsion issues is in Raptor 3, theoretically, and the upgraded version of Booster and Starship. But Elon said that that's not going to fly until the end of this year. So I think one of the big questions is, what are they doing for the next 6 months? I mean, I guess the main thing they're going to do is hopefully get Starships to start re-entering so they can get data on re-entry. But it does seem they're in kind of a bit of a holding period until they get to the third version of the booster.
Yeah, I mean, theoretically, they could, keep flying insufficient versions of Starship that may not be fully upgraded, and then, just to get the data on reentry, like if they can fly a earlier version all the way to the point of over the Indian Ocean and see how it reenters, and they get that data on the tiles, and maybe that's what Elon meant when he was talking about, we're gonna fly however many, starships after, in the next few months, which was kind of a weird thing to say after this failure. Like, wouldn't you want to wait till you get the results of what happened here before projecting something like that? But maybe that's what he meant, is that let's just kind of like empty out the current magazine of starships that we have in our, huge factory. But I don't know.
Yeah, maybe they can get some more confidence and booster reuse along the way. But if the fix is Starship 3, then then yeah, it's kind of a weird place. Joey, you mentioned a great point. Something I think a lot about is the fact that that getting to orbit and even landing Starship is really just kind of like the first big hurdle, because you've got in space refueling. I think landing on the moon is a huge deal because Starship is so tall. It really needs a flat surface, and that can be pretty difficult to find at the south pole of the moon. And then you've got to take off from the moon, right? So after several days on the lunar surface, you've got to reignite those Raptor engines. So I think it's, well, what do you guys like sort of, if they sort of, what is the next step that concerns you most? Is it the refueling? Is it landing? Is it, just sort of, what are you kind of most concerned about from a technical standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, I think cryo refueling is kind of notoriously the big unknown in how, SpaceX is going to solve that. I mean, I'm definitely not an engineer, so I can't really get into the specific difficulties of it, but um, that seems to be one huge thing. And then, as you say, I mean, Starship is very tall, and that might not be ideal for landing at the south pole of the moon. We saw one lunar lander that was also tall not make two of its landing attempts. That might not be the reason why it didn't, but and there's a lot more nuance to that. But that is another challenge, and it's not just Starship. Of course, there's other companies trying to do the same thing, like Blue Origin. And while I think the cryo refueling is the biggest unknown, we saw Dave Limp, the CEO of Blue Origin, today make some comments about their own in-space cryo refueling strategy, and he gave some projection that it might be possible to achieve in 1 to 2 years. So he seems confident, and it was interesting to hear someone talk about it. We haven't really heard much from SpaceX about it yet, so we'll see.
What do you think, Chris? What concerns you about sort of the Starship roadmap?
Well, there's something we haven't actually even touched on because we're focused sort of on Moon and Mars, but it seems to me in the short term, the motivation for SpaceX is to launch Starlinks, the next version of Starlinks. That from their economic standpoint, they really need it up and running to sort of get, those batches up there in the next version of Starlinks. So I think that's sort of the big motivating factor. But then, yeah, I mean, so when I asked Elon sort of the next milestones for this year, I thought he was going to say he was going to talk about cryo refueling, or as he says, refilling. He didn't. He said we got to catch the ship first, which I thought was interesting, and I guess that helps them get to the cadence that they want to get. And now they have the FAA approval to do, 25, and I, Gwen had said something about doing 400 at some point, although I think most of those will come from Florida, not Texas. But yeah, no, clearly there's a lot of hurdles to come, and it's the thing about SpaceX is it's like you can't ever count them out. They're not going to do it on the timeline that Elon probably says, but so far they almost always get it done, or at least change a course to find a path that works.
It's interesting about on the refueling. As recently as last year, NASA was counting on doing that in-flight refueling test, which basically they launch one Starship and then launch another, and they dock in space, and one would transfer propellant to the other in the first quarter of this year. And now it's quite clear they're not going to do that test this year. And I think maybe best case would be first half of next year. And of course that matters a lot for Artemis 3. And so, I think all of us would agree that Artemis 2, the first human mission to the moon, is likely to occur next year. I would say probably in the first half of next year. Right? You guys have at this point, any serious doubts about that?
I don't think so. It seems pretty fair.
So like assuming Artemis 2 happens, and is reasonably successful, and obviously no guarantees with the heat shield concerns and everything else, the rocket just making its second flight and so forth. what is your thinking now on Artemis 3? Because the SLS and Orion hardware presumably will be in pretty good shape. We don't really know where spacesuits are. Axiom, is kind of been having some funding issues, but they've been saying they've been making good progress on the suits. And then obviously you've got the Starship concerns, which has a long way to go to be ready for a lunar landing. What is your thinking? Is that something you would still pencil in as being possible during the Trump administration, or do you think we're further out?
Mm. Eric, if you could just move your mic just a little bit closer so I can hear you a little better, that'd be cool. But sorry, Chris, I didn't want to mean to cut you off.
No, no, all good. I still think it's possible. Yeah, I mean, Elon's now clearly paying a lot more attention to SpaceX. I think he's there. I think I think it might have been a little bit of a rough day after they lost the ship on Tuesday, with Elon being there, and I bet there were some frank conversations that were had, and I know they were pushing hard without him there, but I think that he just brings that that maniacal sense of urgency, and I think they're just going to push harder, and I think that they're really good and they're really smart and they actually do learn a lot from their failure. So I think it is possible from a Starship perspective to do it. Although, I mean, the refueling, landing on the moon, humans having the environmental controls, the ecosystem, the life support system on. There's a lot. I mean, it's going to be tight, and I think it's entirely possible that China gets there before we return.
Yeah, I happen to agree. Like, I don't think, just my opinion, I don't think Starship will be ready to land humans on the moon before the end of Trump's term, just by looking at, you know, how long it took to develop Crew Dragon, for example, for something now as simple as putting humans in orbit. Not to really say that simple, but like relatively, landing on the moon is much harder. And also the rate of progress now, and then also leaving margin for other errors along the development in the next few years, you know, I just don't see how that could be possible to put humans on the surface in the next 3 years using
Is
Starship.
is my audio a little better now?
Sounds better, yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. So against this backdrop, of course, Jared Isaacman is likely to become the NASA administrator sometime in the next couple of weeks. The Senate has to still hold a floor vote on his confirmation, but I think we'd all agree that that seems likely to be a yes vote. So, what are your expectations for him? Obviously, he has ties to Elon Musk, he has ties to SpaceX, but he's also, I mean, I think he's viewed pretty positively in the industry, and is kind of young, energetic, and kind of has a pretty clear vision for where he wants NASA to go. I'm curious how both of you think, will he find success in Washington, D.C., and kind of a new environment for him to be working in as he seeks to implement some pretty significant changes at NASA?
Why don't you go first, Joey? I want to hear what you have to say.
Well, I think the last two NASA administrators showed that being a politician kind of pays off for the agency. When Jim Bridenstine was there, he was there when Artemis was coined and when the whole program really got underway. Um, and the budgets rose year after year. Bill Nelson, you know, he was also a former politician, of course. And so I think that's what the Biden team was thinking in putting him in there, is that NASA kind of needs a politician to make things politically possible because that's how things get done. Um, and then we have Jared Isaacman, who has pretty much no political experience at all. But he does, seem to unite corners of the industry. He's liked by people in the industry, but I think liking him isn't really enough to assess whether he can run a 20 something billion-dollar agency, especially as space is becoming more politicized. Like, it's not that space is becoming less politicized and maybe NASA needs less of a politician as an administrator. It's actually kind of the opposite. Um, so, it's playing a bigger role these days and other types of discussions too. So I think the political nature is just growing. So I don't know, if Jared has the chops to deal with that. And maybe that, in his nomination, that might not even be the intention, is having someone who's politically savvy. There might be other things at play, but yeah, we'll have to see.
So Joey makes some great points. He's not a politician like Jim Bridenstine was, or Bill Nelson, but he has, I think, the political currency that this White House really wants. And I think he's going to have a close connection to people in power because he sort of speaks their language and that he is sort of a tech titan and entrepreneur, a billionaire. He's done very successfully in his businesses. He knows how to execute and get things done. And I think ultimately, in a way, in this sort of political dynamic today, that in a way could have just as much importance and significance in Washington than being a former member of Congress. That said, it's going to be fascinating to see how he balances all of these competing interests. Most notably, the moon versus Mars, the moon or Mars, or is it the moon and Mars? How do you do both? He said we don't have to have these big trade-offs. Okay, let's see what that looks like then, because you know, eager to see what that is. And then the last thing, and really, it's like almost the most important thing for any NASA administrator. It's almost like it doesn't matter to some extent what you do during your term if it gets completely overturned and canceled by the next administration. You have to do something that builds. And I think that's the legacy perhaps of Jim Bridenstine, and that the Artemis program became the first human deep space exploration program to survive presidential administrations since Apollo. It's sort of fascinating now that Artemis now has to kind of quote unquote survive the next administration, which is, of course, the administration that gave birth to it in the first place. But I think that's sort of the test that what Jared's going to have to do, that whatever he does, it can't be done in 3 years and then go elsewhere. Otherwise, it's pointless.
So Joey mentioned coining Artemis, and I just have to put a plug in for Chris Davenport's new book, Space Dreams, which tells the story kind of behind the origins of Artemis. I just read that chapter this past week, and it's quite insightful. So make sure and check that out. The other thing I would say about Isikman is it's interesting. I was talking to a senior Trump official last weekend, and he said he called Isikman the ideal Trump nominee, because he had this background of business success, but he was also had gone into space, so he could go in and talk to the space contractors and with as much or more experience than they had about the actual environment that they were operating in. But he also has support across the aisle. I mean, there's some senators, I'm not sure that they've gone public, but prominent senators, Democratic senators who like Jared and support him. So it will be fascinating to see how he operates in this kind of environment, because he is coming in clearly with the mindset to change things significantly and break things. I mean, Bill Nelson was kind of a caretaker in that role, and he wasn't really seeking radical changes, but Isikman is half his age, dynamic, energetic, and really feels like he has a mandate for change. And so one of the biggest things that he wants to do, obviously, is Elon has talked about going to Mars. President Trump has talked about going to Mars. He talked about going to Mars, of course, in his first administration as well, his first term. And Jared is very much on board with that vision as well. I think most of us were around a decade ago when we had the journey to Mars under Charlie Bolden, and we all kind of chuckled and laughed at it because I don't think we took it seriously. I certainly didn't. It was more like the journey to nowhere, if I can be frank. But I'm just wondering, do you think it's practical that we can lay down sort of the paving stones during the next 3.5 years that puts NASA on a credible path to sending humans to Mars, maybe in the 2030s?
It all comes down to Starship, right? I mean, at least in the first building blocks, if they can get the refueling going, if they can get a fleet of Starships. I mean, right? Like Jeff Bezos likes to say, oh yeah, you want to go to Mars, go to Antarctica or the top of Mount Everest, because that makes, Mars look like a garden paradise. It's like, yeah, like if you're in Chernobyl on the top of Mount Everest, that maybe it's more like it. I mean, it's just like, as a colleague of mine, Joel Achenbach here says, say the first Mars trip, everything goes perfectly. The first human landing, entry, descent, and landing, 7 minutes of terror. They landed on Mars. It's amazing. It's only then you're in crisis mode, right? Even if everything went perfectly. So it's going to just require an enormous fleet of ships to reach the red planet, just to pre-position food, supplies, medical equipment, habitats, all the stuff you need. It's going to take so many flights to get there. It's such a difficult proposition that, you just to actually have somebody up there for you. It can't be like Mars by definition, like can't be flags and footprints because you're there for like 2 years. So
Yeah.
um, that was a pretty artful way of not answering your question, Eric. But I think I think the short answer is it possible to sort of get going? Yeah, I think it is. And you're seeing now Blue Origin, expressing an interest, in this as well. So if you have two credible solutions to go there, then I think it's credible to at least begin the journey and have it be like a real journey, unlike, as you said, the journey to Mars, under Obama.
Yeah. And I think, yeah, like going back to what you said earlier, Eric, is that Jim Bredenstein did do a good job laying the foundation of Artemis to last across other administrations. But I think the NASA skinny budget proposal proposing to cancel Artemis missions after Artemis 3 this seems a little ironic because I think the whole idea of Artemis is to build a sustainable long-term lunar presence on the surface of the moon to inform how, we will live and work on the surface of Mars. And canceling, Artemis missions after 3 just kind of like upends that, but with, I guess, the idea maybe that we can then go to Mars and focus more on Mars. Maybe we don't need as much experience on the surface of the moon. I don't know. I mean, and I just think it's interesting that these policies and something that's going to come out tomorrow too, I think, with the budget, is all coming out before Jared is even in NASA. And so I wonder how he feels about that and what is going to be on his plate when he takes office and how he would be able to create a sustainable program after this work has already been done to propose changes for the Artemis program.
I have a sense that Jared is champing at the bit to get in the office and probably pretty eagerly waiting his confirmation. You mentioned, Joey, sort of how Artemis was supposed to be sustainable. I guess I would push back a little bit on that. I would argue, and I'd love to hear both of your opinions on this, that the dirty little secret is that an Artemis program with Orion and especially with the SLS rocket as sort of your foundational technologies was never going to be sustainable. It was at one mission a year at most, and very expensive missions, and you couldn't really get lots of infrastructure there if that was kind of the backbone of your program. And so, I think canceling missions after Artemis 3 is basically a reflection of reality that if this really is the plan, people are going to say, why are we spending so much money to do just this limited amount of activity on the moon? And that you have to get to the reusable architectures of Blue Origin and SpaceX, sort of end-to-end transportation systems that are reusable to really have a sustainable program. I mean, do you guys agree with that? I mean, could Artemis be sustainable with the existing architecture?
I mean, right. I mean, a lot of people say that SLS is not, capable of having some kind of sustainable role in a long-term program. Vastly over budget, very slow to launch. But I mean, the sustainability part, people also kind of interpret as being on the moon for a long time, right? And there are multiple ways to do that, especially with all the rockets that we have coming online right now. So I think some would say that, it's not only about whether SLS is capable, but it's also about whether the broader strategy of having a long-term presence on the moon is the right one as a precursor to Mars. And there are other ways to do that, instead of relying on SLS and Orion. But I think the conversation right now has just been so dominated by Elon Musk's drive to go to Mars. And I think a lot of people are thinking but I don't know. I mean, feel like I have other things to say on that, but I'll hand it over to Chris.
Well, the thing I would add is that when we talk about like a long-term sustainable presence, I think we automatically think about a human presence, and rightfully so. But I don't know that necessarily has to be that way. And as a longtime space industry person, it's said to me that the thesis could also be to really leverage CLPS, and that you have a lot of landers all over the South Pole operating for a certain amount of time, and that's one way to sort of claim the territory in a way that you sort of, there are only so many landing sites on the South Pole that you really want. And if we're able to get our spacecraft there, then that's a way to sort of, kind of claim the territory and say, China or others, you kind of can't land there because we're operating, albeit robotically, and that's a way to do it. So I think you can sort of do it both. And the other thing that just occurs to me I think a lot of people, or some people think that like actually the Apollo program had a detrimental effect to the long-term, prospects of NASA, that we skipped a step, right? We should have gone to low Earth orbit and had, the learn how to live in low Earth orbit, then go to the moon and then go on to Mars. And by doing that, it sort of, we missed a generation. I don't know that that's true or not, but it does seem a natural extension to at least, try to build something more permanent with a reusable, cost-effective structure on the lunar surface and use it as a building block to go to Mars.
Yeah, I would say we missed almost two generations with that, with that. So speaking of, you brought up China, Chris, and I think that's a great point. In my mind, the only reason why Artemis hasn't just been outright canceled is because China is a very real threat to put humans on the moon, within 5 years, and a very real threat to beating NASA back to the moon, so to speak. And so I'm just curious what both of you think kind of about the likelihood of China's being successful with a lunar landing of two astronauts, by 2030, and what the implications of that would be if they do in fact beat NASA back there.
Go ahead, Joey.
I think there's a very high likelihood that they hit that target. They've been making a lot of quick progress in civil and defense space issues. And yeah, how Jared responds to the quickening pace of China's space program is, I think going to be a major question for him. But yeah, I think it's perfectly reasonable for them to hit their 2030 goal.
Yeah, so when Jared was nominated, remember what he put in his tweet? He said, the United States will never finish in second place or something to that effect. I think it's, a high likelihood that they get there before we return now. And then that puts him in a very difficult position of being like, well, what's the definition of second place? And is he going to have to say, oh, well, we already won because they were there in 1969? I think I don't think it's very likely. In fact, probably impossible that, Elon sends humans to Mars in Trump's first term. As we were saying earlier, it's going to be very difficult for even to get humans to the moon in Trump's first term. But it's entirely likely that China gets astronauts to the moon. And, you can say, oh, well, we got there first in 1969, all you want, but nobody wants to see that happen in the White House. That would be an embarrassment, sort of, I guess, whether that's justified or not, because we did go. But I think any politician, any current occupant of the White House would not want that to happen.
I agree. I don't really hold with the argument that, we could just say China, we went there 56 years ago. I think it's pretty meaningful, the fact that we would be seen as the declining superpower and they would be seen as the rising superpower if that were the case. And I don't think any president wants to be in that situation. So if Jared were to come to you next week and say, I need you to be my chief of staff, is there any way you can see to accelerate a lunar return? If you wanted to we need to get Artemis 3 done before China, how do we speed it up? What do you do?
I just write the stories, man.
Yeah. I just type away on the keyboards.
You guys are both fired.
I feel like I could get fired if I say a few things, but I think, there's a lot of people who have various opinions on that. And I think it comes down to staying course with the current architecture. With SLS, I think one of the reasons people think SLS was spared a complete instant cancellation was because there was an acknowledgement that sticking with it, at least for the next few missions, is really the fastest way to get to the moon. But the lunar lander part is kind of the open question there. That's the big thing. And
that's the elephant in the room. Yeah,
it comes down to Starship and whether that is going to work or whether Blue Origin is going to beat SpaceX there with its own architecture that it's kind of way more quietly making progress on than SpaceX. Not saying they're making faster progress, but they're just doing it in a much quieter way.
Well, Chris is our Blue Origin expert. I can't see Blue Origin Mark II lunar lander being ready within anytime soon, Chris. Certainly not within the next 5 years. Maybe you have a different opinion.
Well, it comes down to the whole cryo thing too, right? Because the system is now so much more technically advanced, which I think is good for the long term, but for a quick, short landing, it's not necessarily built for that because there's so many tech demos they've got to get through. So the question is, I mean, forget human landing. Are they going to be able to land the uncrewed Mark 1 this year?
No.
Yeah. Are they going to launch? Well, they're not launching, it doesn't appear, right, to launch New Glenn this spring. Um,
They got
you know,
they got 3 more days.
so uh, you know, I know you've got some thoughts about that, Eric. I recently was on a phone call with somebody actually yesterday with some insight into this and had said they were hearing more like now we can just, completely go with gossip and rumor and unsubstantiated stuff, but that it was more likely like August. And I think, I don't know, I could see late summer or fall for the next New Glenn launch.
I mean, October feels like summer in Florida, so I think that you could, get away with late summer. I mean, I heard October for New Glenn, but I don't think any of us really have. I certainly don't have firsthand sources on that launch date. So it's very difficult for me to see them launching the Mark One, the uncrewed lunar lander this year. But I just don't see. Historically, they have not moved at a pace that gives me any confidence that they would be ready to put humans on the moon within the next 5 years. So I think again, as we both said, it kind of comes back to Starship. And so if you're at NASA, is there any way you can accelerate the Starship program? And I don't know. I don't know either.
Or is there any way you can accelerate the Blue Moon, Blue Ring program too? I mean, like that's if it does come down to Starship, and if the problem there is Starship's progress, then that could also be said about Blue Origin's progress as well. And I think Dave Limp's entrance into Blue Origin kind of puts an uncertain factor there. I mean, he's been there for over a year now, so and people have described a really new kind of rejuvenated workforce, but so again, it also comes down to him on whether he can move things fast enough.
But it just seems like, again, I'm not a Blue Origin doomer. I really like the potential of the company. It just seems like the first big problem for them really is not solving lunar landers. It's solving cadence on New Glenn. And, they've launched one.
Of course,
and
right.
it took SpaceX, well, typically takes a rocket company a long time to increase the cadence. And New Glenn is a massive, complex rocket. So I just feel like they've got a lot of alligators near the canoe, as Jim Bridenstine might say.
And they got to build a lot of engines, right? Because they got to build not just for New Glenn, they got to build for Vulcan, and that's getting that production lined up and going. And then so then again, just real quickly, and I know we maybe got some other questions, but there does become this sort of interesting political dynamic that if Starship is the way, right, to get there quickly, do you throw more money at SpaceX, right? NASA's investing what, $4 billion in Starship at this point. If you throw more money at them to help them, go faster, that's going to raise all sorts of Elon and conflict of interest, and he's benefiting, from the government, even though there's not really another option. Then or do they not? They may not even care about that.
Looking around at Starbase this week, it did not seem like money was in short supply. I mean, it does seem like this is not a money problem. I mean, money makes the world go round, but it does seem like SpaceX is pretty well capitalized. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to go round and around the circle on this, but I'm not sure what the problem exactly with Starship is. But NASA throwing more money at it, I don't see how that accelerates it a whole lot. But I could be wrong.
But if you're from NASA's standpoint, what else can NASA do to help them accelerate the program?
Also, is what we're seeing on Starship evidence of progress on HLS or the Mars program? I mean, of course, it's too early to really assess that, but is NASA pushing for more progress on the specific HLS things? Or is this Starship program really focused on Mars? And is that what SpaceX is mainly preparing for, with the hope that Elon can shift US policy? And then maybe NASA thinks, well, maybe we can just have Blue Origin do the moon program and SpaceX goes to Mars like Elon wants to do.
It just feels like all those ambitions are swimming in the same lane, though. I mean, they're all you got to get to the gate of having a rapidly reusable Starship that can refuel in low Earth orbit before you go to the moon or Mars. So it's like, I think the progress on one is like almost matches up with each at this point, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So let's talk about Elon's conflicts of interest. It's interesting. He's pretty very clearly seems to be stepping back from his role in Washington, D.C., going to be spending a lot more time at Tesla and SpaceX, but clearly has made a lot of political enemies over the last 12 months. I know a lot of the readership at Ars Technica is very, very unhappy with him, to put it mildly, very skeptical of his actions. Do you think, what do you think the long-term implications of kind of his increased political involvement is for SpaceX and its ambitions to, to play a role in Artemis and go on to Mars?
It's a tough one.
Go ahead, Chris.
Um, it's funny because we always live in the moment, right? In sort of the news moment, and those of us who are like cover the news and watch it, it's always amazing to me when you step back, though, especially in this day and age, and just see how public perception changes over time. Like right now, Elon, with certain segments, large segments of the population is persona non grata, or worse, sort of this personification of sort of Trumpian right wing misinformation and to a certain extent evil. But I wonder if he does sort of put himself on a path that if that perception could ultimately change. It just seems like how many politicians have we seen, public figures, that they're down and out, and then a year later they're just sort of rehabilitated. Now, I do not imagine Elon sort of going the path of, going on Twitter and releasing a video that says, "I'm sorry for the way I've acted," and trying to go that route. Like, I want to earn back your trust, and I, I kind of don't see that happening. But there was a time not that long ago when he was sort of looked at as this, person who was like getting us off fossil fuels, right, with Tesla and saving the environment and, pushing for space exploration and trying to solve problems. I mean, what if, I know there are a lot of companies that are trying to do this. It's not just Neuralink, but what happens if people start, being able to walk again, or see or do some of the advancements because of Neuralink? What if he achieves some success in some of these ventures and maybe doesn't issue sort of like a public apology, but sort of tones it down a little bit? I did get the sense, when I talked to him, and one of the things I quoted him in my story was saying is like, I'm going to still be involved with Doge, but I'm staying away from sort of the real controversial stuff. Like, we're going to do the stuff that we can get a lot of gain for, but with like little pain, like essentially becoming the IT, support for the federal government and fixing these antiquated computer systems. That would be great. Like if you can do that. Um, so I don't know.
Do you want to weigh in on that, Joey, or no?
Yeah, I mean, I think Elon's political involvement, of course, has hurt Tesla, which a company I don't cover. But they're way more product driven and they're publicly traded, so there's more vulnerability there. But with SpaceX, Elon's political involvement in the Trump administration, in some ways, has kind of paid off, right? I mean, the Washington Post, you guys had a great story recently on Starlink being involved in tariff talks, and how it's now kind of tethered to U.S. interests, and countries are more open to approving it if they can get something from the Trump administration in exchange. So that would be good for SpaceX. The shift to Mars, which has been Elon's dream forever, is also good for SpaceX, I think. So and his political culture war involvement, of course, has the risk of angering a lot of SpaceX employees, but a lot of SpaceX employees truly love the SpaceX mission, and it's kind of separate from, the politics of its CEO sometimes. And we haven't seen any major exodus of employees since his political involvement. So I don't know how hard it has really hit SpaceX, especially as much as Tesla. And it might be easy for him to just come back to SpaceX and be like, okay, what has happened since I was gone? But yeah.
I do think there will be long-term political consequences for SpaceX. I think number one, it's going to increase the desire to diversify in contracts, even in scenarios where SpaceX is probably offers the best, cheapest option. there will be a strong desire to have another provider, and it would be great to have other companies other than Blue Origin sort of step up and be able to really fulfill the role of promising new space company that has similarly grand ambitions. And the other thing I think too is like, it's baking in partisanship into space policy.
That, yeah, yeah,
I've long had concerns about sort of space becoming viewed as the playground of space billionaires. And why should we be funding things when we're sending Jeff Bezos' girlfriend to space? I mean, it's like, I just think that all of that feeds negatively into sort of the perception of commercial space, and NASA gets kind of sucked into that. And I just worry that it erodes support in Congress and among the public for spaceflight long term.
What happens when, if the Democrats win the White House, right? In the next election, and there's going to be some, you can see like some retribution potentially coming. So if it benefits him now with Starlink and all that, in a shift to Mars, then it may just hurt him in the next administration.
Let's jump to some reader questions. What are you guys hearing from NASA about Starship? Like, how unhappy do you think some people are at the agency that kind of Artemis is yoked to Starship? They've paid billions of dollars to SpaceX to return astronauts to the moon, and we're kind of still in this messy test phase.
Well, I mean, my immediate, so I don't have a lot of reporting on this, but my immediate reaction is, well, you could have awarded 2 contracts like you said you were going to do. I know you said you couldn't afford 2 HLS contracts when they first awarded it, but you guys are the one that, from the beginning got yourselves pregnant with Starship and didn't have another option.
yeah. The person who made that decision is now at SpaceX. But
No, she's not. She's
Although
leaving.
maybe not anymore.
She's
Wait,
leaving.
she's leaving?
Yep.
Oh, wow. Where's she going?
What I've heard is she's going to take some personal time. So, but
Okay, cool.
but I don't know.
Oh, cool. Okay. Well,
We're talking about Kathy Leaders, by the way.
yeah, but also it was kind of a moot point. But yeah, I think I agree with what Chris said.
Yeah, I mean, I have done some reporting on this, but the reality is that that Jared and I think his leadership team are broadly supportive of Starship and SpaceX and recognize that it's essential to the future of Artemis. And so I think that they're, if the rank and files is somewhat unhappy with Starship, the leadership will be sort of supportive of making sure that it's put in a position to succeed. But there's no doubt that some rank and file employees are probably pretty unhappy with the progress. But the funny thing is I didn't hear much from them back in 2014, 2015, 2016 when SLS was, slipping year for year delays and having all sorts of problems. So
that's exactly what I was just going to say. Like if you're unhappy with the progress of Starship, okay, well, you've had SLS for how long?
Yeah, I know. It's like the contract for Starship were awarded a decade after SLS, right? So, what architectures do you think are most likely for Artemis 4 and Artemis 5 if we still have a lunar program? I'll answer this, and you guys can chime in because I've done some reporting on it. What I'm hearing is that the plan is likely to be similar to the COTS program for low Earth orbit. That NASA is going to go to industry and ask them to propose end-to-end solutions for basically winning a contract to launch NASA astronauts to the moon and bring them back. And so obviously SpaceX would be one bidder in that with whatever architecture it chose, and then I think another potential bidder would be Blue Origin contracting potentially with Lockheed for Orion for its crew transport. Have you guys heard anything on that?
I've heard something similar, and that would of course make sense if we have a very pro-commercial NASA administrator and a pro-commercial administration overall. So yeah, and that has worked out. There's evidence of where there were successes with that. People would, I think, complain that that's just a gateway to give things to SpaceX, but other companies need to step up too. So
yeah, it's like the Ansari X Prize model, but for the moon, right? Just like have a big prize, whoever gets there. I don't know.
Well, it's not really the Ansari X Prize. I mean, in COTS, they gave a lot of money up front to these companies for development and then commercial services.
No, I know, but Newt Gingrich wanted to have a prize for the moon, like to do it
I remember it.
on
And,
time. So
and by the way, I think we all know he's still like very prominent in space policy in this administration. So what goes around comes around. Yeah, absolutely. A couple of questions about actually the human physiology of Mars missions. How concerned should we really be about prolonged exposure to cosmic radiation? And, Chris talked earlier, I think, about sort of you get to Mars, but then it's like a whole other, ball of challenges. Like, we've talked a lot about the transportation system to Mars, but like, can humans survive on Mars for 1, 2, or more years and thrive in what is obviously an extremely hostile environment?
Yeah, I mean that's what we also need to be thinking about if we're thinking about going to Mars is what other life support systems and food supplies and other scientific, engineering challenges that we have to overcome to make that possible. That's not really in the discussion right now. Everyone's thinking about Starship and the vehicles that can get there, um, but yeah, I mean, and I think some people would argue that it'd be good to know if we get some experience on the moon first, which I guess we will. But yeah, so I don't know.
well, so I mean, people are gonna die. It's just I think it's inevitable. I remember the first time I actually ever sat down with Elon, it was like 2014, 2015, and he's talking about Mars, and at the time, like he was going to go there by, I don't know, like 2018 or 2020. And but he said, like, yeah, and people are going to go, and people are going to die. And it'll be interesting to what extent the American public has a tolerance for that. Um, because it's so hard. Mars is trying to kill you. I mean, you can go back and read Homer Hickam's got these great blog posts about how difficult Mars is, and his argument is like we shouldn't go because it's so hard. And he has one of the blog posts is titled like, NASA's not going to Mars, like psst, pass it on, for these reasons that it's just so difficult. But I think, the likelihood of American astronauts, if they go and get to Mars and not surviving, is very high. And then does the American public sort of go like, is there a Challenger / Columbia reaction where everything stands down, or do we say like, no, this was inevitable, like we go to Mount Everest and you step over bodies on your way to as you summit, and you just know that that's part of the deal. Like if you're Shackleton or you're crossing the ocean for the first time, it's just so harrowing and hard that it's gonna happen.
I mean, I do think that if we are going to send humans to Mars anytime soon, you are going to have to accept a higher risk posture. And I don't worry so much about the radiation going to Mars. I mean, it increases your lifetime cancer risk a little bit, but I think there's just so many other much more acute threats to life and limb that yeah, I mean, you're gonna have to take some risks, and I don't know whether we'll accept that or not. It may be private people that end up going to Mars because of that reason. There's a question here about Kessler syndrome, and I'm just curious. We both have seen we all have seen an enormous increase in satellites in low Earth orbit in spacecraft, and if you look at the plans for the next 10 years, we're going to go from 10,000 satellites to 30,000 to 50,000, and there's all these plans for LEO and GEO, and how sustainable is all of this economic activity in low Earth orbit? And, at some point, are we just going to screw up orbits and it's really going to bring this whole industry crashing back down to the ground? I mean, how concerned do you think people should be about that?
I mean, it's very concerning, and I think part of the, how we define Kessler syndrome, I think is interesting because I think some people think Kessler syndrome is just an explosion of debris all at once, and it'll be a major, calamity in a single day. But there's also the perspective that some people have that it's a more gradual thing, and that maybe right now we're in the midst of a Kessler syndrome, and not acknowledging that is not going to help solve the problem of the increasing amount of space junk. I mean, I don't. Luckily, it's not at the point right now where it's preventing us from launching anything off Earth, but um, we have Starlink growing, Kuiper, Chinese constellations, other constellations, Golden Dome, which is going to carry missiles and put missiles in space if that gets funded. So I think there's going to have to be some mechanism internationally to coordinate space traffic. And, also with Golden Dome, the weaponization of space might not help that diplomatically. So I think it is a big problem.
So I think you're thinking about it the wrong way. That if we have a lot of debris and a lot of spacecraft and a lot of junk out there, that's a good thing because it'll protect us from an alien invasion. They just won't be
Oh,
able
right,
to
right.
get through. It's like it'll be our own force field.
You can throw the junk at the aliens or something. You
Right.
can develop like a big
Yeah.
force. Yeah.
Like a moat. Um, I, I, I
Yeah.
I don't know. Actually, I was talking to someone about this recently. Space is really, really big. I think there's still a lot of room. I think you've just got to do it responsibly. And I think the new actors are like Starlink has got what 7,200. They've shown, they can use AI and machine learning and automate it and dodge and weave. That said, I think there does have to be an effort to take some of these big, tumbling rocket stages. Someone once described it to me as like it's the size of a school bus. It's tumbling at, 5 miles per second and it doesn't have a steering wheel. Like that's a problem.
So I think, Joey, you made a great point there that, Golden Dome, we really haven't seen too much reaction from China or even Russia. If we have, I've missed it, but I've got to believe that they will look at that and use that as a reason, and perhaps justified, to like, we're not cooperating with you on anything in space, including space traffic management, and really painting the United States as kind of these malign actors in the militarization of space.
Yeah. China has responded to it and they say it's an offensive system and they're not definitely not happy about it. They're very concerned. Russia had a totally different response, which I'm probably not accurately recalling it, but I mean they said something like this might open the door to more nuclear arms talks or something, which is not normally what you would expect Russia to say in response to something like this. Um, but yeah, I think when the US first tried something like Golden Dome in the 1980s. Of course, there were a lot of technical limitations at the time, but a lot of the allies were concerned too about its ASAT capabilities. And there was a real geopolitical and diplomatic hurdle for developing that system, not as widely talked about, I guess, because it was so impossible at the time. But I think the more people realize what Golden Dome really is, those arguments are going to come back up, and it's going to start to show how much of a um, how much diplomatic chaos there might be after it.
Well, here's just another thing, say, so right now they're talking about $25 billion for Golden Dome and like in the next year's budget, $25 billion. So it'd be more than NASA's budget, like, or about what NASA's budget is now. If we're talking about for this full-fledged space-based interceptor program, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars, if not the T word, right? Like the $1 trillion. And then you remember just a year ago, everyone seems to have forgotten about it, but like at the time, everyone was freaking out that Russia was talking about or developing a space nuke. Okay, well, if you set off a nuclear weapon in space just after you've put up, $500 billion worth of satellites and they fry all of it and none of it works. So, it seems like that could be a little bit of a problem, something they'd want to, kind of figure out before they go ahead with that.
Yeah.
And I don't know, like, if I certainly haven't fully reckoned with what the militarization of space means long term for NASA or for commercial space. Is it more like the U.S. Navy, which patrols the seas to make sure that they're safe for international commerce and movement, or is it something more draconian in that, like, we need to have occupy this high ground, and anything that's not a U.S. or U.S. ally asset is basically the enemy, and or is it like Antarctica? I mean, I don't know. None of us are sort of military space or international policy experts, but I do worry that, like, militarization of space could really put a clamp on sort of the promising promise of commercial spaceflight and private industry in space.
Yeah. And I mean, it's not just, commercial space or civil space that it would affect. I mean, it could affect, terrestrial politics as well. And I think a lot of people are saying that something like a space-based interceptor system is going to totally upend traditional norms of, nuclear deterrence. And so it creates a more unstable, shaky political environment on Earth, not just in space. Countries, of course, can assume more of a civil space part of the US program is linked to military objectives if we're, being more open about it. But there are other consequences as well, like on the Earth that people are talking about.
So all of that is true. It is also true, though, if you are a proponent of commercial space, that if you see sort of a robust growth in the Space Force and reliance on commercial uses for national security space, then it's only good for the commercial space companies. I mean, NASA's budget, again, like 25 billion a year this year enacted is, next year anyway, if these cuts go through, will be quite a bit less than that. The Pentagon is what, $850 billion. Golden Dome alone is going to be hundreds of billions of dollars. That is, if you are a commercial space company, that is your meal ticket.
Hmm.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about negative things. China, space, delays to Artemis, Starship problems. Give me one thing that you're kind of excited or happy about that's happened in spaceflight, or something happened that you're kind of looking forward to, or that made you smile.
Go
Good
ahead,
vibes,
Chris.
good vibes only, guys.
Commercial LEO development?
I said good vibes. Chris, you're killing me, man.
Are we allowed to joke on this? Is like, so,
Yeah, you took the words right out of my mouth, Chris.
I'll just say this, that to be it's good, bad, ugly, delays, not. It is it's a fascinating time, right? To be a space journalist, to do what we get to do, to write about what we get to write about at this time. Everyone says, journalism is the first rough draft of history. I believe that to be true. I think people are going to look back at this time 10, 20, 30 years from now as a seminal moment. That's why, like, go out and people are writing books about this, because I do think to some degree it transcends what we can do. I think the Artemis program, Jared's leadership, it's all going to be exciting to look forward to. What we have next, what happens with Starship, what happens with New Glenn, what happens with Blue Moon, all these other launchers. I mean, we haven't talked about, Eric Schmidt and relativity, national security space and the Space Force. Again, it's just such an interesting time, and I'm here for all of it.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's the real thing, is that humanity is, moving into space, and from like a species level perspective, Golden Dome, have your arguments about that, Artemis program, how we get to the moon, whatever. Everything's increasingly going into space, and I think that's just interesting that we're these little organisms that are doing that. So,
Yeah,
yeah, that's I guess the positive part.
yeah, I think about sort of when I first started covering space really seriously. It was around the time of the Columbia accident in 2003, and man, at that time it was basically all NASA in space, and it was pretty much all about the shuttle and getting the shuttle back to flight, and just the increase in international activity of China, of course, but also India, Europe, Japan, and a whole host of other nations, just getting really serious about space, UAE, Korea, places like that, has been a huge change. And then the commercial growth has just been phenomenal. And there's just so many different ideas being tried in space. A company like Astroforge trying to shoot by an asteroid and failing, right? But just taking a shot at that, I think is is really exciting. You see launch companies like Stoke Space that are trying new innovative things, and there's just so many different ideas that are being tried now, because space is a little more accessible in terms of cost. That the future is dangerous, but it's also very promising. So I would echo what Chris said, that like it's just an extremely interesting time to be in this industry, and we can't really say where it's going, but the ride hopefully will be fun and not too bumpy. Well, with that, let me just thank you again, Chris and Joey, for joining me. I think it's been a fun discussion. It's always great to see you guys. Not so great to see your byline sometime, because I'm like, oh my gosh, I got to try to chase that story that they just had. But it's great working with you guys, and thanks so much for joining us today on Ours Live.
Thanks for having us. Appreciate it.